Hello and welcome to another 5-in-1 Mayaani Talks with me, Mega of Mayaani Jewellery. Now, this is part 2 of the video in which I discussed African jewelry traditions, which is a fantastic topic I cannot wait to share more with you on. If you've missed part 1, please feel free to check it out. In part 1, of course, I share with you some of the fascinating African jewelry traditions from the Maasai people in Kenya and Tanzania through to the Ndebele neck rings of the people of Zimbabwe and South Africa, the Ndebele tribe of Zimbabwe and South Africa, and of course the Zulu love letters of the Zulu people of South Africa as well, the Zulu tribes. So those were three very fascinating for me forms of adornment that were traditionally associated with these groups of all these communities in Africa, and they each showed us just how powerful and meaningful jewelry and adornment has always been for human beings, going way back. And I'll discuss a bit more on that in this video as well. I've been live a minute ago on Instagram, which is why I'm saying live. So yes, in this video here. So today, let's start off with another three very fascinating African jewelry traditions, and those are the traditions of the Tuareg people or Tuareg people of the Sahara, often referred to as the blue people of the Sahara, which I think is a fascinating name for them. So yes, the Tuareg people, who are a nomadic community that have spread across Niger, Mali, Algeria, Libya, and Burkina Faso, to name a few. And then, of course, we'll explore the beautiful Fulani gold earrings of the Fulani or Fula people of West Africa, including Senegal, Niger, Nigeria, and Mali. And we'll discuss just how the Fula gold jewelry, others refer to as Kotenai, has come to become quite meaningful and was created to be quite meaningful and powerful amongst the Fulani people, and why it was they created this jewelry tradition. And then, of course, we'll go finally into looking at the Yoruba people of Nigeria and their beautiful coral bead regalia. And there's a reason why it's called coral bead regalia as well. So, aside from discussing this in today's episode or video, I will also be sharing with you a brief little look at some of the archaeological finds when it comes to adornment and jewelry across Africa. Two key findings which I think were fascinating. And we'll also go on to a brief look at, if I can, sort of a summary of the part 1 and part 2 videos into 5 facts with questions that perhaps we may want to encourage ourselves to ask ourselves. So let's look at the Tuareg people of the Sahara originally, of course, who have traveled across Africa, and it can now be found across parts of Africa, including Niger, Mali, Algeria, Libya, and Burkina Faso, to name a few. And the Tuareg people, otherwise called the blue people of the Sahara, are famous for their silver jewelry. Now, when it comes to their jewelry, the jewelry pendants that they wear have got a cross symbol in them. And this cross symbol represents three things, from what I gather: the 4 directions of the desert, protection when traveling, and also guidance in life as well. Historically speaking, the Tuareg people traveled vast miles across the desert, vast oceans of desert, essentially, is what they traveled across. So for them, it was very important for their jewelry to not only serve as protection, as protective talismans for them, because the desert in itself is a very treacherous place, very difficult terrain, very difficult place in general to travel through. So they needed the jewelry as a form of protection, but also as a form of navigation. And for them, for the Tuareg people, historically speaking, their jewelry has always held a very deep spiritual association, deeply reflecting and communicating their spirituality, as well as reflecting and communicating their communities. So it's been deeply spiritual for them, as well as a beautiful way of communicating their identity. So it's very important to the Tuareg people that when it comes to their jewelry, it's made of silver, and that's very intentional because silver for the Tuareg people has very protective and spiritual properties and qualities. Gold, on the other hand, for the Tuareg people has typically represented external wealth and not really been associated with Tuareg people identity, with their identity as a people. So they've preferred to use silver for their jewelry. And when it comes to their silver pendants, aside from being protective talismans, they have acted as markers of lineage, so being passed down within a family as heirloom pieces. They can sort of mark that family line, as well as acting as symbols of maturity and responsibility. And essentially, for the Tuareg people, their pieces of jewelry and these talismans became and are companions for life. And I love that particular fact because for me, about 3 years ago, the whole idea of making pieces of jewelry that are wedding and occasion worthy into pieces you can wear every single day did not stem from this idea of necessarily having companion for life, but it stemmed from the idea that you shouldn't have your pieces locked away waiting for a special occasion to arrive, because typically in our lives, those come in waves. You have waves and periods where you have lots of celebrations and ceremonies. Then it goes quiet, sometimes for many, many years. And these pieces are just sort of waiting and should not be left waiting, gathering dust, essentially, even if they're stored properly. You're not gathering dust physically, but you know what I mean. They're not collecting memories, they're not alive anymore. So for me, it was from that perspective that I wanted to create these ceremonial pieces that you could wear every day, so that essentially your jewelry became a companion for you through your life, a beautiful collection of the several moments that you wore them and occasions, all those memories associated with those occasions and moments that you wore that piece of jewelry, essentially making that jewelry inseparable from your life story. And for the Tuareg people, their jewelry, these beautiful pendants, are essentially jewelry companions for life. So I love that whilst that was not the intention behind my creation of jewelry companions for you, there's that similarity in thinking of wanting to have a piece of jewelry that is a companion for you through life. Of course, for them, it became a companion for you through life because it was so deeply meaningful as a communicator of identity, and also because of its spiritual associations with the individual wearing it, a spiritual association with the people, the Tuareg people. So there we go. Now, moving on to the Fulani gold earrings. Now, when it comes to Fulani gold earrings of the Fula or Fulani people of West Africa, which includes, of course, Niger, Nigeria, Senegal, and Mali. These gold earrings, or kotenai, which I may not be pronouncing correctly, so apologies for the pronunciation, but kotenai essentially were worn by women, and they were a very, in a way, practical solution to a problem. For these Fulani people or Fula people who are a nomadic community, transporting your wealth had to be something that was easy to do. They didn't want to have their wealth in a stored form that they had to drag around, essentially. It would feel like dragging it around, because when you're nomadic in the desert or nomadic across large pieces of land, vast areas, when you're moving from place to place, every little bit extra you have to carry can feel like a burden, I imagine. So, putting myself in their shoes, I imagine it would have felt like a burden if they had to then store their wealth in a form that meant they had to drag it around. So, essentially, by making their wealth portable through the form of these gold hoop earrings, which were worn by the Fulani women, you lighten the load. You were able to carry your wealth around with you, your economic security. The women were able to wear the economic security, and I love the fact that women wore it as well, because it empowered them in some way, I'm sure, through wearing their families and their own economic security. They were empowered by that very act. So they would wear the wealth and carry it with them in that way, seamlessly, effortlessly, versus actually having it in a stored form that they had to take from place to place. And of course, for the Fulani people and the Fulani women, they would typically receive these gold hoop earrings, very large gold hoop earrings with elaborate detailing for so weddings, for example, as wedding gifts. They would receive them at ceremonies like coming of age ceremonies and other important life events that took place in their lives as well. So I'm just looking back at my notes just to make sure I haven't missed anything there. Yes, so the Fulani gold earrings, as you can see, were in some ways this wonderful people's practical solution to a problem, because they were nomadic, they wanted to carry their wealth around. And gold was very intentionally selected by them as well, because gold communicated familial wealth as well as prosperity and security as well. So there we go. Gold, as we know, is the one very reliable source of wealth. It's the most reliable investment, I would like to say. That rephrase that. It's the most reliable investment you can make, in the sense that gold very rarely ever loses its value. If anything, appreciates in value. So there we are. That's the Fulani people. And finally, looking at the Yoruba people of Nigeria and their beautiful coral beadwork regalia. Now, referred to as regalia because these coral beadwork pieces were seen worn by royalty. They were reserved for royalty and high-ranking officials. And these coral beads were basically incorporated within regalia of kings or oba. I may not be pronouncing it correctly, but kings or oba, as well as high-ranking officials. And historically speaking, the coral beads that were used came largely from the Mediterranean across ancient trade routes, and then the ancient trade routes, that should say. So yes, they were transported across ancient trade routes, largely coming from the Mediterranean, but in the 15th century with Portuguese traders as well. And coral beads at that time were very rare and very difficult to get hold of as well. So that rarity and the fact that they were difficult to get hold of almost added to the prestige associated with these beads. So they really powerfully communicated wealth, as well as communicating in some ways divine authority. So they were reserved for people who were considered to have sacred authority and power over people too. Because I suppose, in some ways, if you look at it, the fact that you managed to get hold of this vast number of coral beads, which are difficult to find in the first place and difficult to get hold of, it's almost like you were chosen to receive them. So there we have it. And now, coral beads, as far as I'm aware, for the Yoruba people, represented life force. They also represented prosperity. They were a good way of connecting with your ancestors. They represented ancestral connections as well as spiritual protection. So, there's several reasons why coral beads were worn. And when it came to the kings or the Oba, they might wear several strands of these coral beads in the form of necklaces or bracelets or even crowns. And essentially, the king, by wearing these pieces, would transform himself into a living, breathing representation of the kingdom's spiritual and political power. So it was very much you were making a statement through wearing these coral beadwork pieces of just how much power, how much authority, how much political and spiritual power, as well as ancestral power, this particular ruler or leader has. Bear with me, I must pause for a second. Right, yes. So, following on from those three wonderful examples of African traditional jewelry and how these African jewelry traditions, not just the ones I've shared today, but the ones previously in general, because I've by no means covered them all, have always had a degree of meaning associated with whatever piece of jewelry was created, not beyond just surface level beautification. So, pieces of jewelry are not just created to make you look beautiful. That, if anything, for most of these cases have shown us the whole fact that jewelry made you look beautiful was an afterthought. That was not the primary function for creating these jewelry traditions. Now, back to at the beginning of this video when I shared with you about the two archaeological finds which we may want to discuss today. There are horses in the background, I've just noticed. Yes. So when it comes to these two archaeological finds, the first beautiful example of the finding when it came to adornment in Africa was in South Africa, and it's the Blombos cave beads that were discovered. And these were essentially small marine shells that had very intentionally drilled precision holes within them, as well as wear markings from where they've been strung and some red ochre pigment, all of which highly suggest that these little shells were deliberately turned into beads for the purposes of being worn as jewelry. And of course, these beads themselves were as old as 75,000 years. They go back as far as 75,000 years, showing us that our connection with this idea of wearing jewelry for a start is as old as 75,000 years, but also showing us that for us, way back when, as tens of thousands of years ago, jewelry has served as more than just something we wear. It has been deeply tied to our identity, a way of communicating within our society, a way of being connected with our spirituality as well. Now, the second fascinating archaeological find in Africa was that of the, now, please excuse my pronunciation again, the Bismoon cave beads of Morocco. Now, these are even more fascinating to me because this finding was a finding consisting of 33 precision drilled shell beads, and they were the shells of the Nasarius gibbosulus sea snail. But the interesting thing about this particular finding is that these shells date back 142 to 150,000 years. Now, that is incredible. So essentially, our relationship with this idea of wearing jewelry is as old as 142 to 150,000 years, suggesting that our desire, if you like, or this idea of wanting to adorn ourselves, wanting to wear pieces of jewelry, is something that's deeply connected to what it is to be a modern day human being. Because essentially, what these dates suggest to us is that the whole idea of wearing jewelry is almost as old as the beginning of modern human culture. So I think that was particularly fascinating, discovering that these beads were that old. And essentially, these particular beads, the 33 shell beads from the Nasarius gibbosulus sea snails, equally had, as we said, the small but precision holes, smoothing around the holes, and also wear markings from movement where they'd been rubbing against people's bodies. So these are fascinating examples showing us not just how across Africa in different cultures, jewelry has been more than just wearing something to look beautiful, but also showing us how, for us as human beings, as far back as early Homo sapiens, wearing jewelry has been a very powerful way for us to connect spiritually, communicate our identity beyond just wearing something because it makes us look beautiful. And I think that's particularly powerful. So it's a very powerful way of communicating our identity. So now going into, if I can, sort of summarizing the part one video and this video's contents into five facts or foods for thought, call them what you will. But here we go with fact number one. I'm going to call them facts. So, fact number one, as we've already discovered, jewelry has marked identity across many African cultures, and it has essentially been a social language amongst the people within these cultural societies and communities. And so, here I think the question that we may want to ask ourselves is, when jewelry has been so powerfully used to communicate identity or communicate messages, historically speaking, across Africa, who controls the message that is being sent or the message that is being communicated? That's a fascinating thought. I'd love to welcome your ideas on what that could be. Fact number two, beads have been used as currency, as we know, and as communication. So, alongside being used as a very sophisticated form of language and communication, beads have been used as currency, historically speaking, and they have been used to mark status, as mentioned with the coral beads of the Yoruba people. They were only reserved for royalty, so they did mark status within that community. That's just one example. They also were used to tell stories across different cultures, with a lot of the beadwork artistry having meaning woven into it, as we've seen across all these African jewelry traditions, particularly the Maasai people of Kenya and Tanzania, and how they use color and pattern very intentionally to communicate certain things, as well as the Zulu love letters, which are created by young women to give their romantic partners to communicate very emotional, deeply meaningful, and personal messages. So they've been used for storytelling as well as being used in ceremonial objects. In addition to all of this, so essentially, jewelry, we can see, has been very symbolic throughout our history as human beings, and not just purely decorative. And somewhere along the lines, I think not entirely, but perhaps some groups of us have lost that connection with the symbolism behind jewelry. And some of us may not always be consciously aware that our jewelry is actually communicating things about us on our behalf, whether we are aware of it or not. So the question here is really, how soon will we realize, if we are not already aware, that our jewelry is a powerful tool for communication? When will we start to look at what messages we want to actually intentionally communicate and pass on to the future generation through our jewelry traditions, and reworking jewelry traditions to allow us to be able to do that where necessary as well? Fact number three, a lot of colonial trade during the colonization shaped many of the traditions we have present today, because essentially colonization resulted in a lot of disruption to a lot of traditions across various parts of the world wherever colonialization took place. And because of that colonial trade influencing many traditions today, I think it's important to ask ourselves how much of the tradition we hold on to today, irrespective of what part of the world we're in, how much of the tradition we're holding on to today is actually influenced by that history of colonial trade. So, how much of it is actually, if we like, authentic, for want of a better word, and how much of it is actually influenced by that colonialization that took place? Fact number four, some traditions actually reflect social constraints. So, by this, for example, if we look at the Ndebele neck rings, the women of the Ndebele people would wear these neck rings once married. They were gifted to them by their husbands' families and often weighed several kilograms. And they'd wear them as often as every day, not just for ceremonies. But the question there lies is, how much freedom, how much autonomy did these women have over how often they wore these neck rings and whether they wore the neck rings at all? That can bring to mind questions of freedom of choice when it comes to certain traditions. And this may be why certain traditions, depending on which voices they perhaps dishonored or didn't honor as much as they could have, whether we want to look at reworking traditions that did that, that didn't entirely honor everyone's voice, and either do away with them completely, because I don't believe it's something women in the of the Ndebele people have to do anymore, which is they have got choice now, freedom of choice. But within that, just looking at other traditions in general, seeing how much of those traditions that we are perhaps still upholding today have served to oppress certain groups within the community and might therefore need to be reworked or perhaps just abandoned altogether. So that's food for thought as well. I welcome your thoughts. And fact number five: many beadwork traditions across Africa were a community craft primarily undertaken by women. So it is thanks across many cultures. It's thanks to women. And their persistence and perseverance and continuation of these beadwork traditions that we actually have the beadwork traditions in existence today. And the women preserve them for many reasons. A, it's a way of continuing the beadwork traditions and passing on that sort of history and that tradition, that culture, and that narrative to the future generation. But for many of them nowadays, it is a very sustainable form of income. It's a source of income for them. So they typically will preserve it and keep it alive from that point of view. But also, you can't say that they're completely doing it for the sake of receiving an income. They are doing it to preserve their culture and their heritage and also form a connection with their identity because it is a representation of their identity, their connection with their ancestry, and the connection with their own identity through that. So, I suppose overall, the question for us to ask ourselves here is whether is not necessarily whether traditions should actually be allowed to survive, whether traditions should survive. Perhaps the question is more which traditions actually encourage human beings to thrive. Perhaps we want to look more closely at traditions that we are upholding and question whether we're just keeping these traditions alive for the sake of, passing them on and preserving them and ensuring they survive, or whether the traditions we're upholding are actually supporting people to thrive. And I would argue it's more important for us to uphold and pass on and perhaps reshape and rework traditions that exist so that they can be this powerful tool for encouraging people to thrive. I think it's more important that our traditions serve to encourage us to thrive rather than just being things that we preserve simply to pass on so they survive and don't become obsolete, essentially. So, yes, I would love to welcome your thoughts on this particular video and the previous video. If you've watched it, I'd love to know which is your most fascinating African jewelry tradition, your biggest takeaway from these videos as well, and this video in particular. Anything that gave you an aha moment or gave rise to, inspired you perhaps to look into something a bit more, or to consider something from a different perspective. I'd love to know your thoughts. Please do feel free to share them with me. Of course, if you enjoyed today's video, please hit that like button. Feel free to subscribe and stay in touch with my content. And of course, the notification bell will help you do that as well. I wish you a beautiful week ahead. I will be back again soon with a new topic, exploring new traditions across a different part of the world very soon. But for now, remember, because your jewelry should always be more than just an afterthought. Bye for now.